Hi, this is BenCB for Raise Your Edge, and today we'll talk about the Postflop game. Especially we'll look into situations when we are the pre-flop raiser and we are in position. I will show you which errors occur when we c-bet. We'll look into spots when we should c-bet and when we should check behind. I will tell you something about the relative hand range, so how we can estimate our hand range on different board textures. After the first 3 points, we'll move on with some example hands, and I'll show you how you can apply these points in practice. And the last 2 points are about optimal bet sizing and about bluffing. I think the biggest mistake at c-betting is that most players c-bet with too high frequencies or c-bet very random. They just think I have full equity and a little bit rest equity and I can hit, so it should be profitable. In Hyper 6 max sit and goes, there are antes in play, and the c-bets are usually very small, and that's why this is partially true. But very often this is not max EV, and we want to extract the max EV in every situation. Often we burn money, or many players burn too much money with too many c-bets, and often the players have not a good game plan for the turn and for the river, which cards are good to bluff and to barrel through. Often there is a lack of plan how we should play the hand or our range correctly, and often boards are misinterpreted. I listed a few examples below. At a first glance, these boards look very good to c-bet. The boards are rainbow and no flush draws are possible, so we could think that we have a very high full equity, but we shouldn't bluff c-bet these boards very often. The reason behind this is just think about how villains range hit these boards, and you'll see that on those boards are so many straight draws, gut shots and overcards. So it is very hard to get our opponent to fold, and we become vulnerable to floats, especially when we are out of position. We shouldn't burn our money with c-bets, and we should check fold when we have no equity. Hands like ace deuce or king 7 in the first example, even if our opponent has a high full to c-bet stat, but you should look at his stats in correlation to the boards, and on this board texture his folding range will be very small, and we are very prone for check raises, especially against unknowns. Of course, we should value bet very light on these board textures. We shouldn't check call with good value hands like a good 8 or jacks, 10s. We should just bet 2 streets for value, and we get very light calls, and when we get action we just fold our hand. We avoid the guessing game that we don't end up in tough spots. That's in general a leak that many players have, that they check call way too much. So pay attention that you value bet more in those spots, but I will talk about that later on. When I talk about too high c-bet frequencies, I'm not only talking about single raised pots, I'm also talking about 3-bet pots. That's the case when we exploit a regular which is folding too much to 3-bets, and we want to bluff 3-bet a lot against him, particularly in the early stage with 10-20 blinds. We have 25 big blinds at Poker Stars, and it makes sense to bluff 3-bet a lot. But when he calls, we have to pay attention that we don't burn our money with c-bets. When we check, we often have the advantage that our opponent thinks that we are trapping or that we have showdown value, so he's often checking his air on the turn again to give up, and we can take down the pot on the turn with a delayed c-bet. So with the check we actually represent strange, and you will notice it that you take down the pot on the turn very often, cause when villain perceives our check back range as strong, he will bet his strong hands on the turn himself that he can get his whole stack in by the river, and that's a big advantage of our flop check back, and you are really wasting money when you c-bet too much on the flop. We have another advantage on our side when we give up those boards sometimes, because we show our opponents that we don't exploit them. So we 3-bet him pre-flop very often, but then we show him that we can give up post-flop. When we 3-bet him all the time and c-bet all the time, he will pick up on this someday, and maybe he realizes it and he adjusts, or he looks at a tracking program to see if we exploit him. So we can show him that we don't exploit him, and we increase our future EV with this play against our opponent. In general, those boards are bad to c-bet when villain called our 3-bet, or when the board is Jack for deuce or King for deuce. Many Broadways have top pair now, and 7s, 8s and pocket 9s are floating too. So you really have to pay attention. It's another story when the board is 4 deuce 4, cause in this case all Broadway combos will fold and you have enough full equity, even against a tight calling range, but you have to pay attention to the dry high card boards that you lower your c-bet frequencies, otherwise your non-showdown graph will go heavily down. Unfortunately, you can't look at this graph for sit and goes. Let's continue with when to c-bet and when to check back. Many people ask themselves, how much should I c-bet, what's a good number? And I can just say, it depends. Your ranges should be dynamic, and of course you should have a game plan. When can you bluff c-bet and when can you just bet for value? I think between 40 and 100% is possible, but I think on average 75% is a solid number, or 68-70%. There are many good players which c-bet very little and delay it to the turn. This depends on your game plan and how you feel about your post-flop skill. There are some spots in which we should bluff c-bet 100% against other racks. This differs from what I told you in the pre-flop course, because I said you shouldn't open raise 100% when they fold a lot to steals, cause everyone nowadays has a tracking program. And when he sees after 100 or 200 hands that you open 100% on the button, you lose massive future EV, cause he will adapt or over adapt, and we shove loser now. The games have evolved and you should evolve yourself. Of course, you can find a rack who don't care about his blind defense, but it's very rare nowadays. Post-flop, it's another story. It takes a long time to get a significant sample size, and many players don't look at the c-bet stat, cause they only have PFA IP, PFR and 3-bet in their HUD. A strong perceived checkback range plays a subordinate role in single raise pots. When we look at a c-bet game plan, what are the points we have to think about? Of course, it's the own hands range, and after this we should think about villain's range and how this board hits villain's range. When we see that his range hits the board very good, then you should give up your air hands or you should check back. When we are still unsure, we should use more information. So that's like fold to c-bet, raise c-bet and fold to turn c-bet. We should use the raise c-bet stat also when we're thinking about betting second or third pair. Sure, we want to take down the pot, but when he is very aggressive, we should check back the flop and then call his turn bet, cause we are often folding the best hand on the flop when we are folding our bottom pair. And when his fold to flop c-bet stat is very low, then we look at his fold to turn c-bet stat when we have enough sample. There are so many regulars with a low fold to flop c-bet but very high fold to turn c-bet stat. Then you can barrel a lot, and you should do this. It's always about exploiting your opponents, and when you have no hands on your opponent, just buy hands. It's not very expensive and nearly everyone does it, and it's so important to have as many informations as possible. When you internalize those things, we can talk a little bit about possible board runouts. We can think on the flop on which turn cards we would bluff again. on which cards do I barrel for value, and on which cards I'm giving up. Don't be afraid, you should not play just one table, and you don't need 10 seconds for every decision. It's about exploiting our opponents, and I will show you how you can apply those things in the example later on. In the beginning it requires a little training, but after that you will notice that it's not that hard. We only have to pay attention to those points. There's no complex theory, but most players are too lazy to memorize those points and steps. And you'll automate these things very fast. It's the same thing that you should shove ace-deuce offsuit with 10 big blinds in the small blind. When you started with sit and goes, you didn't know that. You looked at the Nash charts and now you've internalized it. When you look back after 2 or 3 weeks, this will be very easy for you. In the beginning you should remember yourself that you have to pay attention to those spots when you want to train those spots. And it's also very important that you don't waste time in easy spots. When you have a hand that's a very clear bluff c-bet, don't look always at the fold to c-bet stat. It's important to use your time and strength in the important spots. I see it in the live coachings also that the players look at villain stats when they don't need to, and I think that's terrible. Just play straightforward in those spots. When you have tricky boards or opponents, then exploit your opponents at the maximum and use very use adaptations on your game. As an example, when you normally c-bet 70% in this spot, don't c-bet 65% as adaptation. When your opponent is a calling station, then just c-bet 40%, and that's the important point. Against some opponents you have to c-bet 100%, and very few players know this concept of dynamic ranges. You will find this concept in a lot of different pre and post-flop spots. Let's move on with the universal c-bet. It's a one and done c-bet. It's partly a value bet, partly a bluff bet, and partly an information bet. That's the case when we check behind that we can't call a turn bet cause the board is too scary. So that's very often the case with ace high or bottom pair. We want to take down the pot right now. It's a value bet, and often we get better hands to fold, and we know how strong our hand is. And it's also important that we protect ourselves to get bluffed by our opponent. So we could say it's bluff prevention, cause when he bets the turn we can't call. We have often the best hand, but against his range we perform very badly, and the higher the bubble factor is, the more we should bet those kind of hands on the flop. But we will look into some example hands later on. When should we check back? Of course, when we are giving up. As I told you earlier, when the board crushes villain's range. When we have a calling station and villain is folding rarely, we should adjust very hard. The same applies to a maniac or a regular you have some dynamic with. Then exploit those opponents while c-betting very little. Then we have the pot controlling situation. We have bottom pair or ace high, and we are able to call a turn bet. Then we should check back more hands. Or we have a hand that is only good enough for 2 streets of value, and with 3 value bets we isolate ourselves against a stronger range. So for an example, king deuce suited on a king 3-5 board, we raised on the button and the big blind called, and on this board we only have 2 streets of value with our hand, and we have now a balanced range, cause we would also check ace high, pocket queens, jacks and pocket tens. What's also very important is that we should realize our equity when it is very likely to get check raised. And check raise probability is not that villain is very aggressive. This is board dependent. There are boards in which villain can have a lot of value hands, and we have a draw that we can't broke, and it's a board in which he's more likely to check raise than to check call. I see it very often that they say, oh, I only have the 10 high flush draw, I have to bet here, we get better hands to fold, and so on. This argument is correct, but the fact that we want to see the turn is more important. We want to realize our equity over the streets or the remaining 2 streets. There are some boards when the range is capped and he can't have all the 2 pairs and sets, then we can bet, cause it is less likely to get check raised in this spot. That's the case when we play against other regulars and we can define the ranges very good. And this case is also very important with shorter stacks, so something around 15 big blinds. Because against this stack size, the check shove is much more common, and we can't call off our weak flush draws, and that's why we should check back more hands. Let's move on with the relative hand range. I saw many people misinterpret their hand range according to the board. Here's an example. We have pocket queens on a king 10-7 suited board. We should always value bet this board. We shouldn't check back or check call this board. We are just get into a very tough guessing game when we check call. So many worse hands are calling, and on this board pocket queens is a very strong hand. It's another spot when the board is king deuce deuce rainbow, then we could check and pot control, cause there are not too many floats possible. So look at the relative hand range. Second pair is not always second pair, or a hand like king deuce suited on a king 8-4 rainbow board. The top pair is not strong enough to get 3 streets of value. Sometimes it is hard to get 2 streets against another regular, cause after the second street only better kings are going to call. Especially against the fish, we should bet the queen's hand all the time, and also hands like queen 10 and ace 10, cause we have a value bet against the whole range. And that's a mistake which many players are doing. They check call second pair all the time. Of course, you have to bet full sometimes and you get a feeling that they exploit you, but that's not correct. Long term, you will make more money with this way, and that's the difference between a high stakes and a mid stakes regular. He knows when he can extract value with the hand. He don't play different lines or make fancy plays or is on level 12 or something. He just plays straightforward for value. You have to be aware of this fact, and it's a huge difference. And that's what I say when someone asks me what is the difference between a mid stakes and a high stakes MTT reg. And I think that's one of the biggest differences. Let's start with the first hand. We have ace 4 suited on the button and a regular flat calls. All those hands were played on PokerStars. 6 max hyper turbo sit and goes between $200 and $500. The big blind flat calls, and we have to think if we want to c-bet or not. And this is a board which we shouldn't c-bet against the big blind defending range. There are so many gut shot and straight draws. We can bluff with a lot of draws, so we don't have to semi-bluff a ace high in this spot, and we can just give up this hand. But I made a mistake in this hand. I looked at my hand and I looked at the board and I gave up on this hand, but I didn't look at his full to c-bet out of position stat, cause this stat is with 50% very high, and I think he's not the opponent to check raise 4-5, 4-6 or 4-9. I think he will just give up those hands, so we should make the adaptation to c-bet those hands, cause he's folding so much to c-bets. Most players have a full to c-bet stat of 40 to 45 out of position, and 50 is too high, and that's the reason why I think we have to adapt. But against most opponents we should give up this hand. And we can't call with this hand on the turn. I hope this is clear. Next hand, we are on the cutoff, and when you think about a small blind flatting range, you should know that we should give up here, and we only have the idiot end and we can be drawing that. Let's move on with the next hand. I think preflop is standard. The big blind calls, there are some racks which defend very wide. Then every ace is in their range, and hands like king 2 suited, queen 4 suited, 3-4 suited, 6-5 offsuit, and hands like this, then we can see that those boards cause they have a larger check folding range. But without reads we should just give up those boards. This times we are on the button with king 6 offsuit. We have a fish in the big blind and a potential fish in the small blind. We should open very loose, and the big blind also has a very low 3-bet stat. You want to play as many pots as possible against those opponents when you are a little bit deeper. The small blind flat calls, and you should give the small blind a little bit more credit, especially on those boards. We have a gut shot, a overcard, and a backdoor flush draw, but we should never c-bet with this hand, and there are no implies when we hit the queen. Very standard. So let's move on to the next hand. Preflop is standard. That's a somewhat different spot. You should think now if we want to c-bet or if we want to check back this hand. We have 10 hands on him, and I think this is a little bit meaningful. You can pause the video and think how you would play this hand. I chose to c-bet cause we have to fold on so many turn cards. Only a spade, a 10 or an ace helps us. And we have reverse implies on a diamond 10 and the diamond ace. When he bets a 9 on the turn, we are often folding the best hand, and we don't want that. We want to take down the pot right now. Plus we have good back to equity. That's the reason why we should just c-bet this hand. He looks like he is a little bit looser preflop, so he could have hands like queen 2 suited, and we can take down the pot on the flop very often. There's no reason to bet the turn, because I don't think he's folding a better hand. That's why we should check back, and on the river everything got there and we have an easy fold. Next hand we raise from the cutoff with ace 9 and the small blind flats. That's the spot in which I would raise tighter from the cutoff, cause the big blind is irregular and the button is a very loose fish. When I would normally open raise 28%, then I would open 20-22% in this spot. The small blind flat calls, and you can give up these board textures very often against the small blind. When we look at the board, we should just give up. But when we look at his stats, then we see that we should c-bet. He has a low full to c-bet stat on his first 200 hands, but you can see that his full to c-bet stat in position is very high. So I think his real full to c-bet stat in and out of position is around 50%. I think his low full to c-bet out of position stat is just variance. Especially with his stats, we can take down the pot with a small bet very often. You can see that I'm c-betting very small in these spots. I often played against an unknown or against a fish, and then I size my bluffs a little bit smaller to get myself a better price on the bluff. I think if I bet 40 or 50, there's no difference for him, and so you can save some chips. When I have a value hand, I would bet over 60. The turn is a blank, and on the river we have a little showdown value against Jack 10, 10 9, or flush draws. But he has 2 pair. Now we have the situation that the big blind flat calls. You can think now how you would play this hand. Do you want to c-bet or do you want to check back with your hand? This player is folding 46% of the time out of position. He check raised 16% out of position and bets in 46% the turn when we check back the flop. When you have more sample size, the stat bet versus missed c-bet is also important. In this spot he can only lead the turn cause he is out of position. This stat is very high and that's the reason why we should bet. When he leads the turn we have an ugly spot cause he can have all the value hands. He can have Jack 4 suited, Jack 9, maybe 9-4 suited. Many racks defend very light. We should just c-bet and take down the pot right now. When villain is super aggro and he has a check raise stat of 20%, then I would check back ace king and call many turns. Cause we have to adapt when the people are too aggressive. But against this player we should just c-bet and we get hands like pocket threes or 4-5, 4-6 suited to fold. And some worse hands are calling like ace 10, queen 10, 10-8. And this turn is not a good card. Many draws bust on the river, but I don't think that we can call. When we know that he's capable of bluffing this big, then we should call. When he bets smaller, something like half pot, then I think we should bluff catch sometimes, but here we should give up. Let's move on to the next hand. We have ace 4 suited on the cutoff. You should know that we should use our universal c-bet in this spot. The stats are coming soon, but I think we don't have many hands on him. And we should just c-bet cause the turn is too ugly to play. Next situation, with the weak player we should open king deuce offsuit. He calls and the first view goes to the board, and this board hits his range very good, cause our first consideration should be to give up. But when we look at his range, he plays 41-29 and he is in the big blind. So he's defending very wide. Nearly all suited hands like 8-3 suited, king 5 suited and so on. So we get many better hands to fold, many better ace highs and king high hands, and hands like deuces, pocket threes, and maybe he can hero fold a 4, but I don't think so right now, cause the range is so wide and we have so much immediate profit with the c-bet. So as an exploit we should c-bet, and he has a very high fold to c-bet out of position stat. So far we have 1400 hands on him, and that's a good thing, so we can adjust. When he is an unknown we would have checked this hand back, so it is important to have a huge sample size on your opponents. We are on the cutoff with Jack 10 offsuit, and this hand is a standard open. A regular in the big blind called, and now we look at the board. Many gut shots, straight draws, overcut, plus gut shot are possible, and I only have 61 hands on him. But the stats are filtered, and he is 50 big blinds deep. That's probably why I have only 51 hands on him. I know that he is capable of playing aggressive on the flop, and he's betting a lot of turns, and our hand looks like an easy c-bet. We only have jack high, but it is possible that he bluffs us off the best hand with hands like 6-7, 7-8, 10-8 or jack 8. We have to fold. I think he's more likely to call a hand like king jack than to check raise, and this is super ugly for us. We could reship when he check raises. This is an option, but I think the EV is higher when we check this hand behind. The good thing is that we can represent many cards on the turn and on the river. Ace, king, queen, 9, 10, jack, 8, 7. We can have everything. When a deuce comes off, we could have checked pocket deuces on the flop. When a 7 comes, we could have checked 5-7. When a 9 comes, we could have checked the 9 on the flop. And that's the advantage in those spots. You have to think, can I still represent many value hands on the turn and on the river? It is important that you can represent many value hands, and this is definitely the case in this spot. So I want to check back more hands against this aggressive player. Turn bet versus missed c-bet, so far 2 out of 2. This can be variance, but I know that he is a little bit on the aggressive side. That's the reason why I want a strong range on the turn. Of course, we call all cards on the turn, and he bets the turn. The river is a nice card, and we ship, and he folds. It is lucky that we make this trade. When the river is a blank, it's tricky, but we can still bluff ship the river with our jack blocker. And we can bluff ship a 5 or a 9 on the river, cause we can still represent a lot of hands, and we exploit his high bet frequencies. This was a spot in which I adapted on his aggressive stats. It is important that you always remember your game plan. On the flop we have a gut shot, and this is a problem what I see very often. We have a gut shot, but we don't have implieds on the 10. We had a similar situation earlier, and we should just give up. Okay, that's interesting. When I know that he defends that loose, then we can c-bet more boards. Probably not this board, but other boards, cause he's playing very loose, and we can take down many pots with a c-bet. Next hand we open 10-8 suited from the hijack. The big blind defended, and he's a regular, and I want to talk a little bit about the equity realization at a high check raise probability. At first it looks like he could hit many hands on this board. The board is very drawy and Broadway heavy, so this hits his defending range very good, but he don't have very strong hands on this board. He can't have aces, queens, nines, or ace queen. The only value hands are ace 9 and queen 9 suited. He's very capped in his value range, and that's why the check raise probability is not that high. We should bet 10-8 suited. When the board would be jack 7-5, we have the gut shot and a flush draw, then we could check back this hand, cause on this board he can have all the sets except pocket jacks and all 2 pairs. He has all the strong top pairs like ace jack and king jack, but in this spot he can't have ace king, so on a jack 7-5 suited board the check raise probability is higher, and we have to give up our equity, but we don't want that. We want to realize our equity with this hand, and we're still able to represent many value hands like king queen, a weak ace, pocket kings, and that's why we could check back those hands. And we can call a turn bet with this hand, and when he checks the river we can bluff there. We bluff the river, but we see all 5 cards. The good thing is, when we check back, we represent not too many flush draws, because many players assume that we would bet all flush draws on the flop. But it is important to ask why we are betting here. This is a good spot, and on the jack 7-5 board I would rather check back. The turn card is very bad. We can't bet again and should give up. And on the river we can't do anything, it's just a bad rundown. We could second barrel a 7 or a king. Maybe we can bet a 10 and turn our hand into a bluff. That's a good strategy to get a queen or a weak ace to fold, but I think I would play this hand the same way. Now we have king 9 suited on the cutoff, and this time it's about the relative hand strength. We have a drawy board against an unknown, so it's likely against the fun player. We should see bet here, our hand is too strong to check back. He's calling any 7, any 9, any draw. When we check back and the turn is a queen, we don't get much value if he has a 7 or a 9. So we should just bet straightforward. I think I would bet queen 9 for value 2 on this board. I would bet kings and 10s also. Jack 9 depends, but I would bet queen 9 for sure. The turn is a little bit ugly. I think we can bet again cause there are now 2 flush draws and hands like Jack 10 are open-ender now. And hands like Queen X diamonds have a pair now. I think this check behind is also okay. He bets small, and in the game theory this is not a value raise when he only calls strong 2 pairs and flushes. But this small bet is very often a weak ace or a weak 2 pair like 9-7 or Queen 7. So we should raise fold here for value. This is important. When he ships we have to fold, but he's going to call so many worse hands. And he calls with ace 4, so it is important to raise here. Don't be afraid that he always had the flush or that he is going to rebluff. Of course sometimes he'll have a better hand, but long term he calls so many worse hands. I'm usually not a fan of very long videos, but post-flop is a very complex topic, and especially the flop plays, so we'll look into the topics 4 and 5, so value betting and optimal bet sizing and considerations when bluffing in a different video, cause we can look at these points more separate. And it is important that you deal with those 3 points. So find your leaks and train those spots. When you feel good and understand this video, you're able to use it in-game. I told you this many times. It is important that you automate these things, that you don't have to concentrate on those spots. So the thoughts that we gone through by c-betting, by check behind, when I want to bet my draw, we have to retain these spots, and you can't say in my session I had 0 spots, cause these spots happen all the time. When you had aces, mark the hand and think about how you would play your draws. How would I play against this opponent in general? When you mark 10 hands and review the hands before or after each session, but I think it's better before a session, cause then you have a little warm up and then you will learn these spots fairly quickly. It's not a very complex topic, everything is very logic, and it is not thinking on level 1000. Then you should be fit soon and ahead of your opponents in this spot. So that's it for this video. In the next video we continue with point 4 and point 5. I wish you good luck at the tables, and this was BenCB for Raise Your Edge.